Hello, I'm Dilip Gaonkar, Director of Center for Global Culture and Communication at Northwestern University and Director of Center for Transcultural Studies, an independent intellectual network with institutional roots in Chicago. Welcome to the Questioning the Present, an online public forum devoted to exploring contemporary issues, jointly sponsored by these two centers. Today's 22nd session of the Questioning the Present is devoted to Professor Robert Gooding Williams' new book, Democracy and Beauty, with subtitle The Political Aesthetics of W.E.B. Du Bois, published by Columbia University Press this year. We also have a panelist of three distinguished scholar respondents, Professor Fred Moten from New York University, Professor Lawrie Balfour from University of Virginia, and Professor Shatema Threadcraft from Vanderbilt University. Now let me introduce our four distinguished panelists. Robert Gooding Williams is Brooks and Susanna Reagan Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. In his research and publications, Gooding Williams examines questions related to social and political philosophy, philosophy of race, history of African American political thought, 19th century European philosophy, existentialism, and aesthetics. His writings interpret complex social phenomena and explore the nuanced interplay of race, class, gender, nationality, and other social positions. His notable books include Zarathustra's Dionysian Modernism. Second, Look, a Negro, Philosophical Essays on Race, Culture, and Politics. Third, his award-winning book, In the Shadows of Du Bois, Afro-Modern Political Thought in America. And most recently, the book we are discussing today, Democracy and Beauty, parts of which was originally delivered as Leonard Hastings Scoff Memorial Lectures at Columbia University in 2022. Predictably, in recognition of his achievements, Gooding Williams has received many awards, honors, fellowships, of which I will mention just two. He was elected to American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2018, and he received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2020. Our first respondent, Fred Moten, is a veritable Renaissance man for our time. He's a poet, scholar, cultural theorist, and a performance artist. Currently, he is the professor of performance studies and comparative literature at NYU. He has published extensively. His scholarly works include, among others, In the Break, The Aesthetics of Black Radical Tradition, and The Universal Machine. In addition to these two books, he has published highly acclaimed award-winning theory, criticism, and performance trilogy under the rubric Consent Not to Be a Single Being. The three volumes under this rubric published in 2017 and 2018 are titled Black and Burr, Stolen Life, and The Universal Machine. Moten has also published several prize-winning poetry collections, including Little Edges, The Field Trio, B. Jenkins, and Hewson's Tavern. Further, Moten is known for his collaborative work with Stefan Harney, whom he met while they were undergraduates at Harvard. That enduring intellectual friendship has produced three provocative and innovative volumes, both in form and practice, between 2013 and 2020-21. First, The Uncommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study. Second, A Poetics of Uncommons. And finally, All Incomplete. Finally, Moten is a member of Usang's performance cinema troupe Moved by the Motion, whose work has been shown or performed at prestigious art venues such as Tate Modern in London and Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. This collaboration with Usang has also produced a co-authored volume called Who Touched Me? If I Can't Dance, I Don't Want to Be Part of Your Revolution, published in 2016. In recognition of such an impressive array of achievements, Moten has been honored and celebrated with multiple awards and fellowships, of which I will identify only three. He is the recipient of both Guggenheim Fellowship in 2016 and MacArthur Fellowship in 2020. And he was elected to American Academy of Arts and Science in 2022. Our second respondents, Lawrie Balfour, is a James Hart Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. She's a leading scholar in Black American political thought, and her work focuses on the interplay of race, gender, and democracy in the United States. Her extensive publications include three major books. First, The Evidence of Things Not Said, James Baldwin and the Promise of American Democracy. Second, Democracy's Reconstruction, Thinking Politically with W.E.B. Du Bois. And finally, Toni Morrison, Imagining Freedom. She is currently working on a book provisionally titled Reparation Unbound, Dilemmas of Dismantling Racial Injustice. Predictably, her work has earned her a series of prestigious fellowships and awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2010, 2020-21, and other fellowships at Art Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, National Endowment for the Humanities, the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, and W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African American Research at Harvard University. Our final respondent, Shatema Threadcraft, is a professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt with an additional appointment in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies. She works at the intersection of race, gender, and political philosophy. This is evident in her book, Intimate Justice, Black Female Body and the Body Politics. This book has garnered three distinguished awards. Sarah Valley Award for the best book on women and labor, given by the National Women's Studies Association in 2017. W.E.B. Distinguished Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, also in 2017, and the Best Book Award on Race Political Theory from the American Political Science Association's Division on Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, also in 2017. Threadcraft's second book, Labor of Resurrection, Black Women, Necromancy, and Morrisonian Democracy, was recently published by Oxford University Press in 2020-25. Threadcraft's achievements have earned numerous appointments, fellowships, and grants. She has served as a visiting research associate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg from 2009 to 2012. She was a Ralph E. and Doris M. Huntsman Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton in 2017 and 18. Finally, Threadcraft's research is funded and supported by various institutions such as Ford Foundation, American Association for University Women, Charles Warren Center for the Study of American History at Harvard University, and Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. That brings my introduction of our distinguished panelists to a close. Now I hand the floor over to our profiled guest, Professor Robert Gooding Williams. Bob, here we go.
Yep, thanks to you, Dilip, and to the Center for Transcultural Studies, and to Fred, Lawrie, and Shatema. Dilip and I are former Northwestern colleagues who first got to know each other many years ago through our common friend and colleague, Tom McCarthy. And Lawrie, it seems, I've known forever since she was a grad student at Princeton working on James Baldwin. As I note in my acknowledgments, Democracy and Beauty would not have been written without her encouragement after I presented an early version of Chapter 5 to the Political Theory Colloquium at the University of Virginia. Fred Moten's reading of Sociology Hesitant was critical to my thinking about Du Bois's conception of the miraculous in Darkwater. And today I expect that we will be continuing a conversation about Du Bois' poetry and philosophy that we began at Bard and on the train to Bard a few years ago. Shatema finally has more recently become an indispensable interlocutor, and her incisive critical engagements with Du Bois, both in her first and just published second book, have helped me to think more deeply and with greater nuance about Du Bois's political thought and specifically his understanding of democracy. So I'm going to begin by reading a few paragraphs that come near the end of the chapter of Du Bois's Darkwater, entitled Of Beauty and Death. And I begin with these passages, for much, if not all, of my book of Democracy and Beauty can be read as an extended meditation on these paragraphs and on the concept of beauty they express, and on the contribution of that concept to Du Bois's World War I era political thought. So Du Bois writes as follows: "There is something in the nature of beauty that demands an end. Ugliness may be indefinite. It may trail off into gray endlessness, but beauty must be complete, whether it be a field of poppies or a great life. It must end." With lowercase e, and the end with uppercase e is part and triumph of the beauty. I know there are those who envision a beauty eternal, but I cannot. I can dream of great and never-ending processions of beautiful things and visions and acts, but each must be complete or it cannot, for me, exist. On the other hand, ugliness to me is eternal, not in the essence, but in its incompleteness. But its eternity does not daunt me, for its eternal unfulfillment is a cause of joy. There is in it nothing new or expected. It is the old evil, stretching out and ever seeking the end it cannot find. It may coil and writhe and recur in endless battle to days without end, but it is the same human ill and bitter hurt. But beauty is fulfillment. It satisfies. It is always new and strange. It is the reasonable thing. Its end is death, the sweet silence of perfection, the calm and balance of utter music. Therein is the triumph of beauty. So strong is the spell of beauty that there are those who, contradicting their own knowledge and experience, try to say that all is beauty. They are called optimists, and they lie. All is not beauty. Ugliness and hate and ill are here with all their contradiction and illogic. They will always be here, perhaps God's sin, with lessened volume and force, but here and eternal, while beauty triumphs in its great completion, death. We cannot conjure the end of all ugliness in eternal beauty, for beauty by its very being and definition has in each definition its ends and limits. But while beauty lies implicit and revealed in its end, ugliness rides on in darkness forever. So the ugliness of continual birth fulfills itself and conquers gloriously only in the beautiful end, death. So now a few words about the argument overall of democracy and beauty. So I now turn to that argument, which, broadly speaking, divides into two parts. Chapters 1 through 3 explore what in chapter 1 I describe as the presuppositions of Du Bois's philosophy of beauty, specifically his narrative history of modern struggles for democracy, his normative conception of democracy, and his moral psychology of white supremacy. Chapter 1 limns the contours of Du Bois's narrative history and analyzes his defense of his democratic ideal. Chapter 2 examines his moral psychology, while Chapter 3 explores his idea that the character and culture of the Christian white supremacist inhibit the realization of his democratic ideal. In addition, Chapter 2 relates Du Bois's critique of Christian white supremacist culture to some recent discussions of the politics of the religious right. Taken in tandem, finally, chapters 2 and 3 also explain why, given his moral psychology of white supremacy and the causal significance he attributes to Christian white supremacist character and culture, Du Bois thought that combating white supremacist habits of mind could help to undo racial oppression. Chapter 1 and 2 include brief discussions of Du Bois's accounts of beauty generally, and of artistic and natural beauty specifically, but only in chapters 4, 5, and 6 do I turn to the particulars of Du Bois's philosophy of beauty. Chapter 5 highlights the tension between Du Bois's belief that beautiful events must be complete and his belief that they must disclose unfamiliar possibilities. In this connection, I argue that Du Bois's notion of beauty is temporally bipolar, pointing at once to the past and the future, and that it is beauty's forward-looking power to reveal unfamiliar possibilities of reforming our moral characters and culture, artistic beauty, and of acting to transform an oppressive social order, natural beauty, that he takes to be most politically significant. That said, it is critical to emphasize Du Bois's commitment to the claim that beauty requires completeness. The ultimate roots of that commitment, I suggest, uh, are one, his understanding of beauty in general with reference to the paradigm of a beautiful life, and two, his seemingly religious faith that we redeem our lives and render them beautiful only if at the end it is possible for us, or better, our contemporaries, to look back at them, regard them as coherent wholes, and say, well done. In the background here is Du Bois's reading of the New Testament parable of the talents, a text he echoes in Darkwater's Credo, his politically inflected version of the Apostles' Creed, and in his narrative of the life of Alexander Crummell, which best exemplifies his notion of a beautiful life. And of course, that narrative comes in Souls, not in Darkwater. Chapters 5 and 6 explore Du Bois's conceptions of artistic and natural beauty in detail, and chapter 7 returns to his conception of a beautiful life. Chapter 5 explains Du Bois's conception of artistic beauty with reference to his short story, Jesus Christ in Texas, his 1909 biography, John Brown, and briefly two recent artworks and an example of political theater. Du Bois's aesthetics show that art can challenge received morality, I argue, but they also run the risk of moralism, a risk that, when combined with the assumption that beauty requires completeness, cuts against his desire to promote a democratic culture of the crowd. Chapter 6 analyzes Du Bois's understanding of natural beauty as a romantic, a natural supernaturalist antidote to the pessimistic despair haunting the lives of those who would struggle against entrenched democratic despotism. Finally, chapter 7 builds on the arguments of chapters 5 and 6. Specifically, it invokes Darkwater's essay, The Damnation of Women, as well as Du Bois's infamous book review of novels by Nella Larson and Claude McKay, to show how his religiously rooted celebration of beautiful, complete, and morally redeemed lives sponsors a form of praise that compromises his democratic political commitments. In its application to his fellow female citizens, I argue, Du Bois's philosophy of beauty cuts against his politics. By way of a discussion of contemporary apocalyptic Afro-pessimism, Chapter 7 likewise proposes that Du Bois's account of natural beauty and his rejection of pessimism depend on a pluralist, in William James's sense, depend on a pluralist social theory that parallels the pluralist idea of human agency his political commitments require. Chapter 7 concludes by noting the affinities between Du Bois's reliance on a pluralist social theory and some recent contributions to Black aesthetics that echo Du Bois, specifically work by Fred Moten and Saidiya Hartman. So that's it. And I look forward to the comments and the conversation.
Professor Fred Moten, here you are.
Okay. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you and to discuss Bob's great book, Beauty and Democracy. And I only I want to talk just for a few minutes, in the hope that we'll have a more free-flowing discussion, as a function, at least of uh, my attempts to be brief. There's so much in the book. Um, there's so much food for thought. Um, And that food for thought emerges as a function of the depth and the intensity and the generosity of Bob's attention to Du Bois's writing, and particularly Dark Water. Um, and it feels like in reading Bob's book, I get to go back and read Du Bois again as if for the first time. And that that ability to rediscover Du Bois's work, uh, or I guess maybe technically I should say that ability to discover Du Bois again, is an extraordinarily beautiful gift that you give, Bob. And I want to think about the beauty of that gift in a way that is obviously indebted to your understanding of Du Bois's understanding of the philosophy of beauty, which has as one of its fundamental elements an openness to surprise. And I would even want to call it an openness to difference, an openness not just to difference, but to a constant, and I guess I would probably want to say unceasing practice of differing, that that in my mind, at least, I want to link up to the Dionysian. And of course, this requires us to also consider your first book on Nietzsche, and it allows us to consider, for a moment at least, um, Nietzsche and Du Bois as contemporaries in thought and as thinkers who are addressing, through this question of beauty, a range of possibilities that have to do ultimately with our political realities. What is it? What is our responsibility to beauty when beauty opens us to differing, when it places us in the face not just of difference, but of this constant process of differing. Okay. Now, here's where maybe a certain kind of dilemma emerges. And I think it's a dilemma that only emerges, at least for me, as a function of Bob's reading of Darkwater. And really it emerges as a function of the intensity with which you call our attention to a very, very simple, short three-letter word, and that word is all. Um, and so on the one hand, and just to repeat your repetition of this extraordinary moment in at the end of Dark Water that you just read, but I want to read it again for emphasis. Um, this 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 rich and deep, and for me, I guess I should say discomforting moment in which Du Bois says, all is not beauty. And I'm interested in what for me shows up at least as a kind of contradiction, but I'm perfectly willing to be taught that it is in fact not a contradiction. And I'm hoping, Bob, that you will teach me that today, right? Um, if I think about beauty as openness to differing, and if I think about differing as, because I align differing with surprise, with the new, with the unexpected, with something that is not only a kind of radical non-entrenchment, but an inducement to give up entrenchment on the part of its beholders, right? If I associate beauty with that openness, and it feels to me like your text, your explication of Du Bois's philosophy of beauty is asking us to do that, then how is it that I reconcile the notion, not just that all is not beauty, but that there is some radical conflict between beauty and incompleteness? Because in my mind, in what I think at least is my own Dionysian inclination, I have in my own thinking associated incompleteness with differing. Right? And if I associate incompleteness with differing, and if I associate incompleteness with non-entrenchment, and if I associate incompleteness with openness to differing, with openness to surprise, then I feel like I'm stuck now in a dilemma, right? In other words, my sense, what I find myself committed to, and I suppose this is maybe indicated, in the title of a book that I wrote with my friend Stefano, All Incomplete, and maybe in the title of another book of mine of poetry called All That Beauty. This my tendency, and I would have thought before reading your book that this was a not just a Dionysian tendency, but a Du Boisian tendency to associate all and incompleteness with beauty. Okay. Um, so so I wanna I believe that there must be a way for me to escape this contradiction. I think I must be missing something. Um, but I'm very, very I'll be extraordinarily happy to be taught and to be shown what it is that I'm missing. Um, but of course, all is not only a fundamental term in relation, at least, to the question of beauty for Du Bois, it's also a fundamentally important term in relation to the question of democracy. So, um, in earlier chapters in Dark Water, Bob has also called our attention beautifully and rigorously and generously to another formulation that Du Bois makes. Um, and bear with me for a moment because I have to dig back into my own. I think I'm looking at a different text of Dark Water than you. So actually, the better thing for me to do would be to just find the quotation in your text, Bob, which so excuse me for uh but it's right on the second page of the text. Um, you write, democratic movements, you quote Du Bois from Darkwater saying, democratic movements inside groups and nations are always taking place, and they are efforts to increase the beneficiaries of the ruling. Okay, Du Bois writes. The modern democratic movement has been so, quote, broad and sweeping, he continues, as to accord that aim universal expression, end quote. A product of the 18th century, it proposes, quote, that if all ruled, they would rule for all. Okay. Um, so what I'm stuck on, what I want guidance on, okay, is what appears to be something on the order of a, if not a rejection, certainly an antipathy to all in Du Bois's theory of beauty, which Bob points out to us, and what the relationship is between that and a commitment to all that is clear, it seems to me, that Bob points out in Du Bois's theory of democracy. And of course, this is a problem. This is something that we are being taught to think about by Bob precisely to the extent that he so adamantly and beautifully requires us to consider the relationship between beauty and democracy by way of Du Bois. Right? So, all has one kind of status in Du Bois's theory of beauty and a different kind of status in Du Bois's theory of democracy. And I'm still hoping for more guidance on how to reconcile these two notions, these two modalities of all. Okay. And I do have a bit of a, and this is just to wrap up my very paltry comments, but I have a I I have a bit of a suspicion about I don't know necessarily how to reconcile these two understandings or these two modalities of all, these two valuations of all in Du Bois's theory. Um, but I suspect that one way that one might address the problem of that emerges as a function of these two modalities is to think really, really hard about rule. Okay. Um, I wonder if Du Bois is expecting us or requiring us to consider a certain fundamental relation between something like what we might call incompleteness and unruliness. Okay. I wonder if at the same time, Du Bois's theory of beauty, in which the notion is that beauty is what opens us in a way to being open, is itself an invocation of unruliness. Okay. Um, I this this problem of rule in art, of course, is a Kantian problematic that Du Bois would have deeply studied and throughout his career and certainly in his studies at Harvard. And again, I'm all of these are formulations which are both they're dizzying in their implications, it seems to me. But that they produce for me a kind of ecstasy, right? Like I'm excited to think about these things. And again, I attribute that excitement and that ecstasy to the depth and the intelligence and the intensity of Bob's reading. Um, and so what feels really great about Beauty and Democracy is that it's so learned, it's written so beautifully, it is so authoritative, and yet at the same time, it opens us to questions, right? Um, and it opens us to the openness of these questions. Okay. And again, I find the beauty in this book and the beauty in Du Bois that this book opens us to in my mind at least, it is a beauty that I can't help but associate with incompleteness and unruliness and a certain kind of Dionysian ecstasy that seems, in the first instance, to go against the grain of Du Bois's theory of beauty. But then on another level, it seems to me to be deeply bound up with Du Bois's theory of democracy, right? And so it allows us to begin to imagine what the relationship might be between an unruly and an ugly beauty, if you will, to invoke Thelonious Monk, and an unruly and even something like what one might call an ugly democracy. Okay. Um, and it makes me wonder, well, I could keep going forever and I should stop. I meant to be brief, and so I'll shut up now. Um, I attribute the fact that I could go on forever to you, Bob, and I thank you for it. So,
Thank you, Fred. I have a question to Bob and Fred because Fred is going to leave about half an hour before. So should we depart from our usual format? And Robert, Bob, would you want to give a response now or you would want to wait? You got to, you're mute.
Yeah, I could respond now. Yeah, so uh first thanks so much, Fred, for that very insightful engagement with my reading of Du Bois and indeed for bringing that reading into conversation with my earlier work on Nietzsche. And I must say that my thinking about Nietzsche and some of the things to which Fred uh, alludes was very much, or I should say, Nietzsche and some of the Nietzschean themes to which Fred alludes was very much in the background of my thinking when I wrote Democracy and Beauty, more so, I think, than, although, to some extent when I wrote um, In the Shadow of Du Bois, because the thematics, the theme of pessimism is at work in both cases. And, I spent a lot of my life thinking a lot about Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and pessimism. But let me come now, all that said, let me come directly to the question Fred raises. And the key, I mean, it's a beautiful question. I think there is a Nietzschean answer, which may indeed be a Du Boisian answer. So I'm going to focus first on the first question, then on the second question. But you might remember that Nietzsche distinguishes between two kinds of pessimism, Dionysian pessimism, romantic pessimism. And that distinction comes into play in the gay science. I think I haven't looked at the text recently. I think it's maybe 370, section 371 of the gay science. But one can also take a look at the introduction or the preface, I don't remember what Nietzsche calls it, that he appends, I believe, to the 1886 edition of The Birth of Tragedy, where again he distinguishes, and I'm blanking now on the exact terminology he uses, where but where he makes a very similar distinction, and the key here is between a pessimism that is, as it were, predicated in lack, or what might be called incompleteness, uh, uh, and that seeks, Nietzsche says, rest and calm seas, and a pessimism that he associates with a kind of completeness, a kind of plenitude, and I invoke that distinction because I think Nietzsche would want to question, and this and it would very much specifically want to question the assumption that we think a difference, or the practice of differing, as Fred puts it, uh, in terms of incompleteness, in terms of lack, in terms of want, in terms of deficiency. I mean, the backdrop here is a kind of critique of Schopenhauer, for whom a kind of want, kind of deficiency, a kind of lack is kind of constitutive of the human, a constituent of the human condition. So I think that Nietzsche, and I don't know that this solves. This certainly isn't the last word, but I would argue that Nietzsche's conception of the Dionysian, especially in his later thought, wants to associate a difference with a kind of a fullness and plenitude, the practice of differing with fullness and plenitude, and not with precisely not with incompleteness. So and again, so that just is a kind of prima facie, sort of answer. It doesn't really do justice to the kind of the philosophical question that Fred raises, because there is a philosophical question as to whether it's coherent to think difference, or the practice of differing, in terms of completeness, in terms of fullness, in terms of plenitude. But prima facie, I think that's the direction that that Nietzsche wants to go in, and that arguably Du Bois wants to go in. I hadn't really thought of it in these terms, to the extent that Du Bois wants to associate surprise and the practice of differing, openness to the future, unexpected future possibility, and the like, with completeness. How do those two things go together? And I think something along the lines of a Nietzschean answer would be the right answer. Now very briefly, on the second question, how does that go together with Du Bois's politics? And that again is a great and a terrific uh, uh, question that resonates a little bit with a conversation that Fred and I had some years ago, where I attempted to engage some of what Fred was alluding to his poetry collection, all that beauty, but that phrase, as I'm sure many of you know, comes from Baldwin, James Baldwin, and it's something that a phrase that Fred invokes in the context of a critique of Arendt, and Arendt's characterization of Du Bois of Baldwin as a political thinker, which is characterization that, at least then, I don't know if Fred has changed, thinking has changed on this matter since, but then Fred, in some of his writing, Fred has been resistant to the idea that we should think of Baldwin as a political thinker. I recall that conversation because I think Arendt is obviously a critical point of reference for anyone who's kind of thinking about a politics as rule versus politics, in more arguably fugitive register. Politics as something that involves something other than rule. I guess the paradigmatic category for Arendt would be the category of action. I mean, I'm talking to people, an audience that members of which aren't very well. So I won't belabor the point, but simply gesture towards Arendt's critique of a conception of politics as well, which is at odds with a certain conception of sovereignty. In other words, you might associate politics understood as rule with a certain concept of sovereignty, which Arendt's emphasis on action and plurality and so forth and so on is very much at odds with. Now I mention all that because one thing that occurs to me, even in light of my attempt to kind of evoke Nietzsche and the distinction between kind of Dionysianism and romantic pessimism, differing, a practice of differing that's grounded in platitude versus a practice of differing that's grounded in lack or incompleteness. That so what's the point here? Well, the thought might be that there is a deep tension in Du Bois that Fred has brought to light. Not that there's and here I'm not talking about the contradiction to which Fred initially uses. I'm not talking about the contradiction to which Fred initially alluded, because I've suggested that there's a kind of Nietzschean way of getting past that contradiction, but rather to the possible tension or contradiction between Du Bois's aesthetics and his politics, because it may just turn, I think it may turn out that Du Bois's conception, I think, look, the discussion of democracy, comes in a chapter entitled "Of the Ruling of Men," so that it may just turn out. This isn't focusing so much on the term "all," but I'm trying to get at what I think is more is conceptually at stake. It may that in the chapter of the Ruling of Men, where Du Bois develops his conception about democracy, he's conceptualizing democracy in terms of rule. It's not an alternative. Again, broadly speaking, Arendtian a conception, if you're thinking about democracy in terms of plurality and difference. It's not what you get in Wolin. I mean, and again, I don't mean to be assimilating too quickly Arendt and Roland. I know that's a very complicated conversation, but again, this audience knows that Wolin very, when he's developing a notion of fugitive democracy, distinguishes democracy or politics conceptualized as rule and a conception of the political, which is at odds with rule. So the thought here finally is that those dichotomies may be operative in Du Bois vis-a-vis on the one hand his conception of democracy, which is still indebted to the politics of rule. And in my first book I argue that Du Bois is very much thinking about politics in terms of the category of rules, so that might remain. But it may be if that is aesthetics understood again, not as romantic pessimism, is driven not so much by the idea of romantic pessimism, but more by what I've called a kind of Dionysian pessimism, which understands the practice of differing in terms of a kind of plenitude and so forth and so on. There may be a tension, a conflict in Du Bois's thinking in that vein. Yeah. So I'll stop. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, Fred. Do you want a very quick response because we need to move on?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I apologize that I have to leave early. In my department, today is the day that we have prospectus exams, and I have a prospectus, a dissertation prospectus exam at 12:30 that I have to be at. But um, I just want to, well, what I would, well, the next time we're riding on a train, Bob, and we have a whole lot of like time to talk, one of the things I would, well, who I wish was here is the late great Cedric Robinson. And our book, All Incomplete, the title is actually from a really extraordinary moment in the chapter on anarchism in Cedric Robinson's first book, which is called The Terms of Order. And and it is not only a critique of the idea of rule, but I think it really wants to try to unearth the way in which rule remains, as it were, in rule in political theory, even when political theory imagines itself to be at odds with the notion of rule. But if Robinson were here, I would, and what's interesting is the way he invokes Nietzsche, right? In the interest of arguing for um, a notion of incompleteness. And my sense of it is that he is being properly Nietzschean there in a way that I think you would also agree with, Bob, in this respect. Um, well, I don't know if you would agree. What if it turns out that incompleteness is not associated with lack, um, but rather is associated, but it's also at the same time not associated with fullness either, but it's associated with something like what one might call non-fullness, where non-fullness could indicate both that which is less than full, but also that which is more than full, with a kind of overflowing, with a kind of unlimited abundance, so to speak, that would in fact allow us to take into account a kind of indeterminate futurity that is somehow a part of the all, even if its contours aren't already known or determined, right? And and so what if it turns out that the notion of all that might link up our aesthetics and our politics in the spirit of Du Bois would be one that attends to this non-fullness, right? That doesn't relegate incompleteness to lack, but which also at the same time doesn't like completely yoke beauty to death and to an absolute fulfillment. So
Hmm.
So thanks,
That's
Fred.
great. It's a longer conversation, but I appreciate those remarks, and we'll continue, Fred.
okay, thank
Be
you.
sure to record your conversation on the train next time. Okay, we are now going to move on to our second respondent. Lawrie, my apologies for delaying your presentation because of Fred's contingency. So here's Lawrie Balfour. Floor is yours.
Well, first, I want to say really no apologies necessary. In fact, my preference, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Great. My preference would be to listen to Bob and Fred continue the conversation for the remainder of the time here, because I find that it's already yielded a whole range of new questions and thoughts that beyond those that the book already inspired. It's a daunting assignment to be invited to comment on Robert Gooding Williams' interpretation of W.E.B. Du Bois. From Du Bois's Countered Sublime, which appeared in Massachusetts Review in 1994, to the remarkable book at the center of today's discussion, Bob has set the standard. Indeed, he has long been the voice that I hear when I write about or teach Du Bois, pressing me to think again and harder about whether an interpretation I'm offering is faithful to the figure I encounter on the page. While the texts and topics vary widely, all of Bob's readings are meticulous in reconstructing Du Bois's historical and intellectual environment, and simultaneously marvelously creative in making unexpected connections and moving adroitly across boundaries of time and genre. Just as In the Shadow of Du Bois captures the spirit and argument of the souls of Black folk, the author of Darkwater comes alive in Democracy and Beauty. At its core, this book asks a question that occupied Du Bois for much of his life and remains no less pressing in our time. What role can beauty play in the struggle for democracy? And more specifically, what role can it play in the struggle for democracy against a backdrop of slavery, colonial rule, the ongoing cultural power of white supremacy, and the global entanglement of racial domination and capitalism? Democracy and Beauty takes up Du Bois's effort to answer this question in the years immediately before and after World War I, a time when Du Bois must reckon with the fact that rational arguments about Black humanity, no matter how carefully presented, are insufficient to counteract the snarling and putrid threads of hate, these are Du Bois's words, that spread themselves throughout the world. It's also a period when he reckons more fully with the ties that connect the fate of African Americans to that of the darker peoples of the world. Now, of course, Du Bois was attuned to the limits of reason and to the global reach of white supremacy in his earlier work, but they come to the fore in Darkwater, and Democracy and Beauty traces Du Bois's response to these challenges. As Bob noted, a defense of aesthetic education that disturbs the smooth operation of the Christian white supremacist worldview through artistic beauty, and that interrupts the pessimism of the oppressed through natural beauty, opening them to the possibility of social and political transformation. Now, there's much, much, much more to admire here than 10 to 12 minutes allow. So what I'd like to do is to try to pose 3 sets of questions that were stimulated by the rich and provocative arguments laid out in Bob's book. In his 2005 introduction to a special issue of Public Culture on Du Bois, Politics, and Aesthetics, Bob describes the souls of Black folk as, quote, both a call to arms and an aesthetic event, and once a manifesto, an electrifying sound and light, thus a book that demands to be read equally as political argument and literary art. I found this characterization of Du Bois's earlier work especially illuminating when approaching Darkwater, and I think it's consistent with the claim that Du Bois explicates and exemplifies his concept of beauty in Darkwater. So my first set of questions concerns the role of what what Bob calls literary art, in addition to natural beauty, in provoking, inspiring, sustaining non-white opponents of white supremacy. When Du Bois writes about Phyllis Wheatley in 1941, it's striking that he not only identifies her as a forebear of David Walker, but also situates himself as her heir, insofar as he echoes elements of his own self-description from Darkwater's postscript. Looking out from her own singular and narrow corner of the world, Du Bois writes, Phyllis must have had visions of the souls and voices who, coming after her, fulfilled her promise and tradition. So I'm interested in hearing more about how Darkwater carries that tradition forward and vivifies its role in African Americans' fight against democratic despotism. How Du Bois's self-fashioning as a poet or an artist in this book aims to speak with and to readers he situates within the veil. Democracy and Beauty begins to address this question in its concluding paragraphs, which take up sociology hesitant and Fred Moten's engagement with Du Bois. But I'd like to hear more about how the literary art of Darkwater, whether it's in one or more of the individual entries or in the interplay of pieces across the book, makes an appeal to Black readers, which is a piece of the argument that I think, I mean, perhaps this is such an obvious question that it didn't require fleshing out in this text, but I was interested in the also the ways in which the notion of a tradition fulfilled as opposed to a complete life might connect to Bob's reflections on Du Bois's aesthetics. My second set of questions actually pursues this issue of completeness, and I have to confess I will do so in far less, in a much less profound way than Fred just did. And I want to focus on the idea of the beautiful life. In Du Bois's view, Gooding-Williams, Bob argues that a natural occurrence, a work of art, a religious vision, or a life counts as beautiful only if it comes to an apt end that can cast the event in an unfamiliar, astonishing light, in a strange light. When a life becomes beautiful through death, he continues, it comes into view as a coherent undertaking that encompasses its past, even as it augments our vision of the future. And we see this fleshed out in the book in the difference between the ways in which Samuel Coleridge Taylor's premature death reflects what Du Bois calls the real and unforgivable waste of modern civilization, and concludes with the chapter on Alexander Crummell from Souls, which shows a life, his life, in Bob's words, to have been a unified enterprise that triumphed over tragedy and ugliness. Now, while the claim that an encounter with beauty can defamiliarize what's taken for granted and promote democracy by stimulating citizens' receptivity to reviewing existing hierarchies, both crystallizes the final paragraphs of Beauty and Death and is compelling in its own right, I'm still struggling with the idea of an apt end. The concern here is not only that Du Bois's conceptualization can produce a kind of moralizing judgment that's especially problematic in his idealizing portraits of Black women, and I find Bob's reading of Damnation entirely persuasive, as is the contrast he draws between Du Bois's tribute in that essay and Saidiya Hartman's meditation on the Song of the Corinne at the end of Wayward Lives, which point to more possibilities that are simultaneously more beautiful and more democratic, perhaps, than Du Bois's imagination allows. Still, I wonder whether there are other connections between the presentation of the story of Coleridge Taylor in Darkwater and the telling of Crummell's life in Souls that actually exemplify an aesthetic closer to Hartman's. One that dwells, for example, in the moment when Coleridge Taylor takes to the podium at the Crystal Palace, a moment Du Bois remarks that seemed and was prophetic, as well as in the other instances when we glimpse Coleridge Taylor's brilliance before it's subsumed by the relentlessness of the ugliness around him. If his life ended too soon for perfection, Du Bois concludes in Darkwater that the real lesson, that's his language, is, and here I quote, "Humanly speaking, it was sheer accident that this boy developed his genius." Accident in the sense that he didn't grow up in the United States where it would have been thwarted from the beginning. And that, and here I quote again, "We have a right to assume that hundreds and thousands of boys and girls today are missing the chance to develop their unusual talents because the chances have been against them." Now, clearly this distillation of Coleridge Taylor's story into a single moral is too neat. It is moralizing. Nonetheless, I want to suggest that it's in the details of an imperfect life, like the glimmer of Josie's intellect in Souls, and even Du Bois's fanciful account of Crummell's encounter with the little blue fly, also in Souls, that stay with the reader, or with this reader anyway. In fact, I have to admit that I find it too easy to forget the final paragraphs of the Crummell chapter, which transform tragedy into divine comedy. They appear to me to be awkward consolation, and it's the glimmer of wasted promise that lingers. And in this sense, I wonder whether we might count among Du Bois's accomplishments as a democratic theorist and literary experimentalist his construction of a gallery of unfinished lives. And here I want to use Baldwin in a direction I think slightly different from the one that emerged from the exchange between Fred and Bob a minute ago. But I think that part of what one takes away as a reader from Du Bois's work are these moments that don't simply prompt the reader to wring her hands or to mourn an ugly past, but to pose the question of the future, and that is Baldwin's question. What will happen to all that beauty then? And finally, I'd like to ask Bob to say more about the relationship between beauty and militant opposition in the fight against white supremacy. Rereading A Beauty and Death, I was struck that in between Du Bois's observations about sunset and moonlight in Montego Bay and his account of the awful sight of the Grand Canyon, he tells the story of the First World War through a chain of events that moves from the refusal to allow Black soldiers to enlist, to the institution of a degrading Jim Crow draft, to the premature retirement of Charles Young, to the execution of soldiers in Houston, and the massacre of workers and their families in East St. Louis. If the narrative affirms the endlessness of ugliness, of apparently bottomless hatreds and old battles being fought again and again, Du Bois also touches on the unfamiliar in the form of khaki-wearing Black strangers coming to the rescue of France, and in the interruption of the misery of mud and war by the wild and sweet and wooing strains from bugles of Black soldiers. In this sense, of Beauty and Death intimates that there's another response to white supremacy, another way to defamiliarize its habits and vanquish the despair of the oppressed. That's the experience of salvaging democracy through militant action. This is the sort of action prophesied in the souls of white folk as the struggle for freedom when black and brown and yellow men, which black and brown and yellow men must and will make. And it's the sensibility of the 1919 essay, Returning Soldiers. So my final question is about how to understand the contributions of beauty and Du Bois's project of aesthetic education, alongside his warning to anyone who refuses to see that democracy must encompass all of humanity. And here I quote, we return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why. Thanks.
So we have our third speaker, Shatema Threadcraft. She also seemed to be under a lot of duress about having to move. She is moving from one place to another. She is right now, I think, in Brown, is heading to University of Virginia. Can you hear?
Yes, I'm here. I'm in the hills of Vermont or New Hampshire. I don't know. I'm somewhere.
Yeah, right. Wherever you are,
Wherever I
you
am,
can
but
speak with your voice.
yes, I'm happy to be here with you all. I want to say, Bob, I want to thank you for this wonderful book. I had the good fortune to see your 2018 plenary address to the Foundations of Political Theory section at APSA. And the title was Propaganda, Beauty, and the Moral Psychology of White Supremacy on the Political Aesthetics of W.E.B. Du Bois. So it was a really important occasion for me in many ways. So first, I learned so much about Du Bois, as I always do from Bob. But more importantly, for my work today, it sparked my interest in what Edward Bloom called Du Bois's lynching as crucifixion stories, and what Michelle Kuhl called his martyr tales. And I would eventually read many of them, and they would become foundational to my work. So I want to thank you for that. And I learned so much from this book as well, and I'm very much looking forward to teaching it. So I found your explanation of Du Bois's concept of democratic justice and democratic despotism concise, clear, and compelling. I was riveted by your characterization, his characterization, and importantly, I think your interpretations of the political dispositions and character of the mob and the crowd, and his understanding of the role that beauty can play in taming the mob such that it might have the democratic openness and epistemic humility of the crowd. So the book is not only great in that it provides tremendous insight into your thinking about Du Bois, but I think it will be a great teaching resource that we can point to students as a guide to many of his key political concepts. And I want to say that I was absolutely blown away by your reading of The Damnation of Women, how you point out the fact that Du Bois himself cannot practice the necessary epistemic humility when it comes to women. And so today, I think that your reading of it exceeds my own. It's really great. And I think that it is kind of definitive right now. And I was convinced, truly convinced by much in the book. And I only had questions about the role of natural beauty in stemming despair in Black life, about why artistic beauty might not also play that role. I also had questions about why you did not spend more time thinking about the relationship between artistic beauty, natural beauty, and that which your friend, the great Saidiya Hartman, calls beautiful experiments. Finally, inspired by your reading and my own work going forward, I want to think about the relationship between the crowd and Toni Morrison's yard. So on democratic justice, you say, for Du Bois, justice involves responsiveness to individual interests. It is a matter of giving appropriate weight to everyone's interests. As I read him, you say, moreover, this is precisely the idea of justice he advances when he depicts a world where the interests of no human will be neglected, when he insists that women need the ballot to right the balance of a world sadly awry because of its brutal neglect of the rights of women and children, and when he inserts that Negro enfranchisement would entail Black men in the South would have to be treated with consideration, have their wishes respected, and their manhood's rights recognized. Right. So, and let's see, you talk about situated knowledge, like needing different walks of life and to have different experiences of problems and policies of public interest, et cetera, where You say finally, epistemic diversity is essential to justice, for in the last analysis, Du Bois writes, only the sufferer knows his suffering. Now, this was absolutely great, and I think it became even sweeter when I read your devastating analysis of the damnation of women, taking Du Bois to task for his epistemic hubris and his claim to, quote, know women. So I loved your analysis of the mob and the crowd, and I've read Du Bois and spoken of his preoccupation with the mob, with mob violence, which I've placed in conversation with Toni Morrison's Thinking About Private or Intimate Violence, but I had not thought at all about Du Bois's theory of the crowd and its relationship to democracy. This was beautifully done and will be amazing to teach. So you say Du Bois distinguishes two kinds of groups: the crowd, marked by a receptivity to the unfamiliar possibilities and dispositions that the group's strangers represent, and the mob, marked by a tendency to constrain an otherwise infinite human nature by choking back and usurping the voices that would express these possibilities. And then you go on later to say that Du Bois metonymically figures white Christian culture as a culture of the mob, more precisely the lynch mob, for it quashes the voices of the strangers who have chosen darker skin, projecting them as subhuman criminals and not as members of the group. America's white Christian culture perpetuates racial oppression, but Du Bois hopes that the cultivation of the democratic culture of the crowd will erode it, and thereby alleviate racial oppression. So here enter artistic beauty, which gives this receptivity to the unfamiliar to make change. So beautiful art can mandate an alternate conception of a genuinely Christian life and call on the Christian white supremacists to repudiate the beliefs, feelings, and ill will that have led her to exclude Black voices from her circle of concern. Yeah, so all convincing and very interesting. On to the damnation of women. I want to say that I think that your reading of the damnation of women importantly extends a line of critique that Kathy Cohen leveled against Du Bois for the Philadelphia Negro and is along the lines of Elizabeth Spellman's critique of Plato and woman as body. So Cohen in Deviance as Resistance says that Du Bois's keen sociological insight failed him when it came to thinking about women, and you demonstrate that his political insights, his democratic insights often did as well. So Spellman says that Plato was able to say beautifully non-sexist things about women when he was thinking of the soul, but as soon as he began to think about the body, he became sexist again. And I suspect that some of this somatophobia clouds Du Bois's insights as well. A point I wanted to make, though, or a question for you, is that I wondered why, for a people so long associated with the natural over the cultural, you decided to focus on natural beauty as a source of their inspiration and not press Du Bois on Hartman's beautiful experiments. So over and over again, I thought about my own experiences in Cape Town, South Africa, where I often say that that place makes you confront the beauty that the creator has made alongside the ugliness of what man can make. And that is that these strike me as completely different processes, the results of which can sit very comfortably next to one another. So why not devote more time to the beautiful experiments in living, even ones that, as Hartman points out, can end tragically? So can't these beautiful experiments keep us from despair? Now, finally, I've juxtaposed Du Bois's abolition democracy and Morrison's, what I call her truant democracy, in my work. And I argue that Morrisonian democracies aim at reparative sexual and reproductive justice, and this is a necessary corrective to Du Bois. Again, Saidiya Hartman writes that the material relations of sexuality and reproduction define Black women's historical experience as laborers and shape the character of their resistance to slavery, yet this labor falls outside the heroic account of the Black worker and the general strike. So this, she says, has dire consequences for what Du Bois imagined for women within his abolition democracy, where she says, quote, marriage and protection rather than sexual freedom and reproductive justice were the only ways conceived to redress her wrongs and remedy the wound dealt to her reputation as a human being. So the sexual violence and reproduction characteristic of enslaved women's experience fails to produce a radical politics of liberation or a philosophy of freedom. Lawrie Balfour, reflecting on Morrisonian democracy, notes that Morrison pays attention to the private or disregarded spaces of African American experience, often places where communities of women gather, away from the imperatives of the patriarchal order. And so I talk about in the text about how the home is a very significant place for the for Morrisonian democracy as a place to enact Morrisonian justice. So their home for Morrison they are the spaces of small scale democratic practices aimed at repair in the wake of intimate injustice. Home provides the space for inchoate self knowledge to come to full flower, the space for healing where there can be no cure, wherein collective storytelling and the collective provision of healing care through their very enactment helps to build within the healed the capacity to go out, as Morrison says, and do some good in the world, right? But upon reflection, I know that it is not just the home or the space inside of the house, but a great deal of Morrisonian democratic work takes place in the yard. So much takes place in the yard in Paradise, which I see as a key Morrisonian democratic text. And after reading your work, I have thought about the crowd in the yard, right? So thinking of the crowd that comes to save Setha in Beloved, right? They come into the yard to save her. Um, and I want to think now, I wonder about how Du Bois might speak back to Morrison with this concept of the crowd and what it might illuminate for Morrisonian democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Shatema. Thank you very much. Bob, now you have time to respond to all three of them. And then
Wow.
we'll
Yeah. So rich, so many interesting and insightful thoughts. I obviously would not be able to do justice um, uh, to what's been said. Just one more thought first, I suppose, relating to my conversation with Fred and what he was saying vis-a-vis his, his work with Cedric Robinson and the like. Um, my only, and again, this is a much longer conversation, but I would, I think, argue that there may be some affinity between Du Bois's conception of completeness and what he's calling incompleteness. And I would argue that Du Bois's conception of incompleteness is not, I think he's operating with a lack conception of incompleteness. So we could agree in terms of the kind of larger um, the productivity of the kind of concept that he and Robinson are trying to develop. But I would suggest that conception of incompleteness is not Du Bois's conception of incompleteness. So that's one thought. Um, Coming to Lawrie and to Shatema, there's a lot to say, and I'm not sure that I can do complete. I'm sure I can't do complete um, justice. So I'm not sure what I want to say about the idea of a tradition fulfilled, or about the idea of continuing um, a tradition. That and what Lawrie had to say about Du Bois's use of the concept of completeness, how it engages with Black readers, how it might apply to how it applies to uh, his discussion of Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Uh, um, on those points, I want to say, I guess, a couple of things. And again, I feel that what I have to say is profoundly inadequate. I do think that the address to Black readers, at least as I construct the argument of Darkwater and as I reconstruct Du Bois's philosophy of beauty, comes in the context of a discussion of natural beauty and the anxiety, the worry about Black pessimism, the aesthetic as a response to Black pessimism. And that's already, at some level at work in what's going on my reading near the end of the Sons of Black Folk and the movement from, the Coming of John to the Sorrow Songs, but I think it's also at work here. This, of course, relates to a point that I think Shatema is just raising. Why not artistic? Why maybe artistic beauty could function in a similar vein? And I think that's right. I don't think that's how Du Bois uses the category of artistic beauty, but I don't see why in principle artistic beauty couldn't function um, in that vein. I think there's also an affinity, I guess I want to say, between now. Um, it was interesting to me that both Lawrie and Shatema kind of um, invoked Sadia's work. Um, 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 uh, Shatema's asking, why did I have to say what? Yeah, maybe I could have said more about beautiful experiments, and I'll come back to that in a second. Lawrie, in suggesting, I think if I understood the argument right, suggesting that maybe there's an affinity between the kind of thing that Shatema is up to in Wayward Lives and the idea that even in imperfect lives there are moments, beautiful moments, as it were, that open us to horizons of possibilities. I think that that's all. Um, I think that that is all true. I think that notwithstanding my attempt to kind of put a kind of Nietzschean face on Du Bois's conception of completeness in response to um, Fred's reflections on the completeness incompleteness dichotomy. Notwithstanding all of that, I think maybe I can imagine myself criticizing myself by saying, "Aren't you reading too much of Nietzsche into Du Bois?" Because I think that Du Bois is, as I suggest in the book, operating against the backdrop of a kind of profoundly religious Calvinistic there's this Calvinistic sensibility, and I think there's this idea of a kind of complete life as a redemptive life, as a life that's somehow overcome ugliness, and I do think that's a really high bar, and and you might think, well, and other folks who have read this have, I think, raised similar questions. Isn't there much going on in a life that we want to understand, in a life that we can't grasp as complete in Du Bois' sense, as redeemed in Du Bois' sense? Um, isn't there much going on in such a life that could be understood, say, in terms of the category of beautiful experiment, and Shatema's kind of bringing that category to bear, as a counterpoint to, what I have to say about natural beauty. I think, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, I do note that, just to come back to the very end of the book, after invoking the ending of Wayward Lives and talking a little bit about Shatema's Sadia's short entry on the possible, I say Du Bois need not, if Sadia is right, Du Bois need not have looked to natural beauty to disclose the social world's vulnerability to action intended to interrupt it. She implies, for closer at home were beautiful unfinished lives whose transformative agency revealed the same vulnerability. So I think that that's right, and that there is a kind of there is a way in which Du Bois's the commitment to completeness obscures, can lead us to lose sight of a possibility that animates what Lawrie called um, um, incomplete incomplete uh, 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 lives. Um, right, right. So yeah. So there is the idea of a gallery of unfinished lives. I mean, I think the interesting thing here is that is one question I guess I was raised trying to put all three comments together, is whether or not, if we think in terms of a gallery of unfinished incomplete lives, do we end up returning in a way that perhaps Du Bois would not fully appreciate, to something along the lines that Fred is talking about, vis-a-vis, in other words, is there a kind of convergence between what Lawrie and Shatema, want to talk about in terms of unfinished lives, imperfect lives, the possibilities revealed by them, what we might say about Morrisonian democracy and the like, and the kind of productivity that Fred wants to associate, with an eye to Cedric Robinson, of a productivity that is predicated neither on a fullness nor lack, but something else, but that has a kind of hopeful, productive, politically fruitful possibility about it. And I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it does occur to me that it's an interesting question to ask. That there might be that it's useful to in other words bring into conversation the kind of question that the view that Fred is articulating there, and all that Lawrie and Shatema want to say in discussing beautiful experiments and unfinished lives. Yeah. I guess yeah, and on the point, I guess again, I'm not being as systematic as I might, otherwise want to be sometimes. On the question of militants, beauty and militant opposition, again, there I thought I was trying to engage with that, vis-a-vis again Du Bois's engagement with natural beauty, that somehow, and this resonates with, the discussion of sociology hesitant. I think that that Du Bois is thinking that natural beauty is a source of inspiration that can bring to light a possibility that otherwise, this is what I want to say, that has otherwise been foreclosed. So yes, we can talk about beautiful experiments and the like, but the question is always, um, uh, is such experimentation a real possibility, and where do we look, to maintain our hope in the possibility of that sort of experimentation? Perhaps one of the limits of Du Bois's thought is that he's looking to, and maybe primarily to natural beauty. Maybe we should also look to artistic beauty. Maybe we should look to the beautiful lives around us, which would be the point of the turn to Siadia's work, or perhaps even to some of Fred's work. So I think I think that I'm completely happy to to take that on board. I think I guess maybe I'll conclude just by saying that the thing about a thinker like Du Bois, I mean, I think there are resources in Du Bois's thought that resonate with much of what Lawrie and Shatema are pointing to, and that the virtue of much of the virtue of what they've been saying in response to maybe my reading of Du Bois is that, hey, look, there are other voices than the voices that I accentuate, other moments in Du Bois's thinking or in Du Bois's writing that are at odds with the representation of Du Bois that I offer, where I try to kind of represent Du Bois as having a kind of coherent philosophy of beauty, but that seems eminently plausible. I think with any interesting thinker, if you engage the writing, there is always going to be a tension. The more interesting and complicated the thinker, the more likely we will find that what seems to be the systematically kind of, or the coherent, philosophically, as it were, official position, and moments in the text that uh, uh, that speak against that a position, that put that position into question. So, I apologize for not doing justice to the richness of everything that everyone has had to say, but maybe I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Bob. Now we can open it up to Fred. Before you disappear, want to say something? You're mute.
I just
Fred,
want to say that I'm very, very sorry that I have to go, but I feel very lucky to have been here and have been a part of this conversation with Bob and Lawrie and Shatema. And thank you and congratulations, Bob. And I'll be talking with you soon. So, okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Fred.
Thanks, Fred, for joining us. Thank you so much, making out of your busy schedule. And now we move to Lawrie. Do you want to say something, Lawrie, in response to Bob? And then we'll open it up, assuming Shatema is still here. Okay. Yeah.
I'm still here.
Okay, good.
Sure. So there's much too much there, and I just have I think two thoughts in response to all of both the provocations of all of the comments and Bob's response. And the first actually goes to where Bob ended, which is the point about a tension between a kind of providing a coherent account of Du Bois's philosophy on the one hand, and the fact of his being a rich and complicated thinker who's always going to exceed, and indeed, by design in some senses, the way in which he writes Darkwater, that it's polyphonic in its, even in its title. I think that that's always there, but I do wonder, and this is really a genuine question for Bob. I mean, whether there is something about Du Bois in particular, which is always, I mean, I think in which one is always toggling between that kind of coherent account of a political philosophy, of a moral philosophy, or aesthetic, and a political aesthetic on the one hand, and the ways in which he writes, which frankly for me just invite, I mean, there are many writers who are complicated and contradict themselves, or who shift over different, over times. But part of what I think is so stunning about Du Bois's work, especially in a book like Darkwater, is the way in which it advertises those tensions. It's calling attention. So we have this extraordinary reconstruction of his argument that Bob offers us, sort of at the same time that I think Du Bois is calling attention to all the things that don't fit. And so I'd be interested just to hear Bob reflect on that a bit. And then with the question of militants, I mean, I think that was also partly a question about to what extent what Du Bois calls the darker world, and in particular, the world that exceeds the United States, is itself, I think, a critical site of the idea of for Du Bois, bringing Africa and democracy together is itself it's both a beautiful and an unfamiliar idea for the readers. And so I wanted to know more about that, sort of how this notion of the darker world figures in the account that that Du Bois is arguing, whether there's a connection there to Bob's account of Du Bois's political aesthetics, democratic aesthetics.
I just want to jump in and say that I'm very happy to be in the conversation, but I don't have, and look forward to continuing the conversation with Bob. But I don't have anything right now to respond to it, but thank you.
Okay, we can now open it up to our audience, because we still have a substantial amount of time, about 20 minutes at least. So, do we have any?
I think we have one question in the chat. Surafel, would you like to ask your question? Or I can also read it.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. That was a wonderful conversation. Congratulations. My question is, I can read it. The writer mentioned that Du Bois is bipolar in terms of consideration of the past and the future, as much as this is a view that protests against unilinear, unidimensional, and closed complete time. One would see the bipolar hyphenated in psychoanalytic lens. If this would be tangible, what ugliness stressed Du Bois in his own present, not only in the US, but in his own global present moment? How do then chaotic and stressful temporality and spatiality animate or cut Du Boisian planetary or multipolar conception of beauty. If, to consider his own present moment and at the same time at a global level, how would he conceptualize his idea of beauty? Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that I fully appreciate the question. I mean, it resonates, I think, with one of the points that Lawrie was just making, asking me to relate Du Bois's what Du Bois wants to say about beauty um, to his talk about the darker world and the unfamiliarity of a kind of discourse that links, democracy to the darker world. But let me just say a few things that again I don't expect to do justice. First on the point of the bipolarity, in the book, what I suggest is that the tension. I try to situate that tension against the backdrop of a certain tension in modern European aesthetics between a certain way of thinking about the beautiful, a certain way of thinking about um, the sublime. And I suggest that uh, 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 to the extent that Du Bois is thinking about beauty in terms of coherence, completeness, and the like, there's, broadly speaking, a way in which, um, or the category of perfection, there's a way in which you can kind of position Du Bois's thinking with reference to, Baumgarten's 18th century, essay, Reflections on Poetry, Kant to some extent, later Du Bois's teacher, Santayana, who also conceptualized beauty as perfection. But there's a way in which that that way of thinking, you know, um, involves the idea that or thinking about beauty is connected to the judgment of taste. And there are other ways of thinking about beauty or about the work of art, the aesthetic broadly speaking. And backdrop of my mind, is something that Gadamer talks about in one of his essay, where he suggests, influenced by Heidegger, obviously, he's moving from thinking about art, he thinks about moving in his aesthetics. He thinks about a move about he gestures towards on one hand, the judgment of taste, of course, but then he says, we have to distinguish the judgment of taste from the experience, of the work of art. And there are essays in which, he sees an anticipation of that way of that move beyond thinking about aesthetics with respect to the idea of a judgment of taste, the experience of the work of art. And at least a couple of places, he kind of connects that to uh, uh, the discussion of the sublime, in particular the discussion of the sublime and the dynamical sublime, I think, in Kant in particular. So that's not irrelevant to the larger questions. I think that Du Bois and um, the last question, yeah, the questions that Lawrie and the last questioner posed, because I think that it's precisely, and I said this, I think, in my opening comments, it's precisely that movement towards that gesture towards the possibility, towards an unanticipated future, which I've suggested might have some connection to kind of antecedent received discourse about the sublime. It's precisely in that connect. It's precisely with reference to that dimension, um, um, the future-oriented dimension of Du Bois's thinking, or his concept of the beautiful, that I think that concept requires a kind of political significance, and enters into the role that beauty can play in undermining democratic despotism, where Du Bois thinks about democratic despotism, as an international political economic formation involving the domination and exploitation of the world's darker peoples. Now, the argument there is kind of complicated because you might say, well, what would beauty, either natural or artistic, what might it do? Here, I think the relevant beauty is artistic beauty, and the way in which it can undermine white supremacy. But to get at that, one has to think about the role in which Du Bois assigns, white supremacy vis-a-vis the reproduction and the perpetuation of imperialist domination and exploitation of the world's darker peoples. And in the book, I kind of position Du Bois in the world and what he's doing in this respect vis-a-vis, Luxemburg and Hilferding and Lenin and the contemporary Marxist discussions of imperialism. Hobson is in the background, of course, but when all is said and done, I think that that it's important to Du Bois to understand that culture plays a role in facilitating the perpetuation of the exploitation, the domination of the world's darker peoples. It's causally significant, and there's a kind of, I won't go into how that works, but there's a kind of story that I tell in the chapter, an account that I give in the chapter.
Bob, we are losing you. Bob, your voice is gone.
Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can hear you.
So long story short, yes. You can't hear me?
Dilip, we are able to hear Bob clearly.
You need to intervene with it.
No,
Can you hear me now?
We can hear him, Bob.
You can or you cannot hear me?
We can hear you clearly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll shut up in a second. So the basic idea is that culture plays a kind of causally significant vis-a-vis the perpetuation of, imperialist domination of the world's darker people. And it's precisely for that reason that beauty has a role in upsetting, undoing, destabilizing white supremacist culture.
Okay. So we have, Ramon, could you ask your question? I also got a question in the email, but I mean, Ramon, please go ahead, unmute yourself and ask the question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful discussion. I wanted to ask a question related to some of Professor Balfour's questions. So many of the real and fictional lives that Du Bois discusses in Souls are often framed as tragedies. Alexander Crummell, Josie John, even his own son. And these lives seem to be characterized by both beauty and ugliness. They kind of stay with the reader in part because of how bittersweet they are in each of their unique potentials and strivings, coupled with the often incompleteness and sorrow of their lives that result from racial oppression. So if we're thinking about beauty as a kind of completion with a clear beginning and an end, I was hoping you could expand on how you see tragedy operating within that account, given that it seems to be sort of inherently characterized by the ugliness of suffering and the incompleteness of lost potential.
Bob, we need you to unmute.
Sorry. Sorry. So I'm just so excited, but Lawrie mentioned, invoked the idea of a kind of divine comedy, with reference, I think, to my reading of Crummell in my first Du Bois book, which, I echo at certain moments in Democracy and Beauty. But the thought there is, that the kind of, and here I'm just piggybacking on Northrop Frye. The thought is that the Christian, story of human existence is a kind of comedy. It has a happy ending. Let's put it that way. And so too does the story of Crummell's life, where in some sense, coherence, God meeting Crummell in heaven and saying, "Well done," that kind of overcomes what is otherwise a tragic life. That said, and this maybe allows me to say more precisely, what I was trying to get at when I was responding to some of what Lawrie as well as Shatema were saying. You might say, well, look, I mean, you, Du Bois, think that in order to redeem a life, you've got these moments of ugliness and these moments of tragedy, and that redemption requires that you overcome it, and that you be able to look back and see, yes, that ugliness was overcome in such a way that allows us to see your life as having a kind of completeness, a kind of coherence, a kind of wholeness. But you might say, well, look, let's put that aside. Maybe you're misreading these moments of ugliness and tragedy maybe we could find in these moments of ugliness and tragedy what someone like Saidiya Hartman calls beautiful experiments. That is to say, what Du Bois is seeing in maybe Josie's life, or in the, as it were, tragic moments of Cromwell's life, could otherwise be read, interpreted, understood as, or in Samuel Coleridge Taylor's life, could otherwise be understood as sites of a sort of beauty, manifest, redemptive possibility, let's say, something along those lines, that Du Bois, to which, to which Du Bois is blind. Du Bois isn't that there might be another way. I'm not being very articulate now, but there might be another way of seeing those moments, as it were, in a kind of positive light that might warrant application of the category of beautiful or beautiful experiment. I don't know if that's kind of. I'd be interested to know if Lawrie thinks that or Shatema thinks that that's picking up on what they're getting at. But the point is that we might want to question the designation of a particular moment in someone's life as ugly or as tragic, and allow that it can be understood otherwise. That there is hope or possibility, or where that one where Du Bois only sees tragedy and ugliness. Yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Okay.
Samuel Shapiro, could you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Gladly, yes, thank you. I'm intrigued. I'm looking forward to reading the book, which I haven't, but I'm intrigued by the notion. I forget who mentioned it. It may have been Lawrie, of crowds in Du Bois, and I'm wondering what this notion of crowd in Du Bois, if we might usefully compare it to the thought of someone like an Elias Canetti on crowds. I don't know if either of you, if Bob or perhaps Lawrie would want to comment on that.
Yeah, surely. I think I have a footnote somewhere. When I was working on this, I was in conversation with I think Axel Honneth about some of these categories, and he pointed me in the direction of Canetti among others. But look, I think that this, one has to be kind of very careful, especially when one is kind of looking at translations from the German into the English. Sometimes the kind of distinction that's relevant here kind of will disappear. But long story short, at least for Du Bois, broadly speaking, the category of the crowd is characterized by a kind of openness to difference, to borrow some of Fred's language, to difference, to possibility, to the stranger. Whereas the category of the mob is, again, I suggest, what Du Bois has first and foremost in mind is a lynch mob. So for what I argue is that the category of a crowd is the category that Du Bois uses when he wants to think about the culture of democracy, right? So, you might think of Du Bois as someone like Dewey, who wants to think about democracy not simply as a set of political practices or procedures, but as something that involves a certain culture. And I think the category of the crowd is a category around which his thinking in that vein pivots in Darkwater.
Lawrie, would you like to add to that? Or?
Vidra, I think I'll.
Yeah, please go ahead.
The only thing I would add, just as a sort of a question or an invitation, is I'd love to hear Bob talk a little bit about the crowd and his reading of the Comet, because it strikes me that that's at the end of the Comet, you have you can see the distinction between the crowd could become the mob. I mean, that it could go either way, but we don't, it's a fairly thin vision of what the crowd at that moment, at any rate, all it is not a mob. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the robustness of the concept of the crowd in Du Bois.
Can I add something, Bob, to the Laurie's question?
That's a great question, and I appreciate that the invocation is thinner than perhaps my reading wants it to be. Um, uh, but uh, um, but nonetheless, I do want to insist that it ends on a note of joy and a kind of affirmation, I think, of future possibility. I think that earlier in the text, I try to kind of develop the concept, drawing on some of Susanna Siegel's work between dispositional mobs and actual mobs, and try to flesh it out a little bit, but it's not as fully articulated in Du Bois as I wish, as I wish it were. On the other hand, I think that it's there, it's doing some work, and it's important to pay attention to, because he's beginning to gesture towards uh, uh, again, in a kind of Deweyan spirit, a conception of democracy, not just in terms of politics or rule or what have you, but as a cultural form, and the category, and so the category of the crowd is working, in conjunction, I think, very importantly, with the category of the stranger, which is, as crops up throughout Dark Water.
Dilip, you had a question, so you want
to. Bob, when I was reading the early part of your book, I was also puzzled by this distinction between the crowd and the mob, because, within the sociological tradition itself, there's a great deal of discourse on crowd, which sort of borrows from the Labonian notion of crowd as a very negative category. In the liberal democratic theory, there's a kind of a equation that crowd invariably becomes a mob. In fact, the word mob is actually a mobile crowd, and a mob invariably becomes violent, and violence eventually leads to destruction of property and life. That's the kind of a liberal equation. And in a way, it's interesting that in some way, Du Bois is trying to recuperate and, in a way, distinguish between mob and a crowd, whereas the traditional distinction was usually trying to distinguish between crowd and the public. Public is seen as somehow a different kind of entity, which could be in some way inclusive, but sometimes historically has been exclusive, when you think in terms of public sphere and so on. So it's really interesting about how, this distinction between crowd and mob has worked out in Du Bois' imagination. It probably has a lot to do with the overdetermined conception of mob coming out of the kind of a lynch mob phenomena. And I think it's very historically grounded, rather than invoking the entire tradition of the distinction between the crowd and the mob, because negative dimension of crowd goes all the way back to the Roman bread and circus and business and so on and so forth. It requires actually quite a bit of work to recuperate crowd as a emancipatory agent. And in fact, it can be done. I think it would be very interesting to actually invoke that. In fact, it's something I work on myself on that point. But I also want to ask you a question about this. You did make references in a particular, in responding to some of the questions about you invoked the concept of the sublime. But at the same time, as you work through this distinction between, one Fred raised about relation between incompleteness, difference, unfinishedness, and all of them, and somehow, as opposed to perfection, completeness, beautiful lives, as opposed to troubled lives, or in all of those kind of things, the distinction between, or the dialectic between beauty and ugliness, how they may be worked out, although how might one work through to beauty? We are the the, unavoidable dimension of ugliness in human construction, at least human lives as well as human artistic productions. But what would happen if you were to look at that from the standpoint of the sublime in a way, as opposed to juxtaposing ugliness and beauty? If you were to use the beauty and sublime, would that be more useful in any ways? Or you think that would be able to give us a better grip on the way in which Fred was trying to push for incompleteness and difference and openness as the prerequisites for beauty? Yeah, that's my
Yes.
kind of,
So
yeah.
good. So a couple of thoughts. What I was saying is that, and what I suggested a couple of points in the book, certainly in, some footnotes, is that built into Du Bois, part of what makes Du Bois's concept of beauty difficult, if you're thinking about it against the backdrop of modern European aesthetics, is that built into his concept of beauty, I think, in Darkwater at least, are elements of the way or the ways in which the sublime has been conceptualized. And in the book, I make reference to not only, I think, in the text, I think, to Burke and Burke's conception of the sublime, but also in a footnote or two, to Kant's conception of sublime, or the way, or at least to the way in which, Gadamer takes up Kant's conception of the sublime. So this is just a kind of conceptual point. The discourse with Fred is just all about how you can kind of, it bears on this question, because to the extent that, as I said before, to the extent that Du Bois is thinking about beauty in terms of completeness, there's something kind of conventional. You can find, completeness, perfection. You find it in Baumgarten. You find it, in Santayana's conception of beauty. But Du Bois wants to add something to that, and to the extent that he wants to add something to that, I think he's gesturing in a direction that goes beyond what I described as these early modern, this early modern, and when you get to Santayana, maybe later modern conception of beauty. On the relationship between the beauty and ugliness, maybe I should say this. I mean, when I first started working on this, and I was presenting some of the work to philosophers, they would, I presented it as if I was kind of, so it seemed that I hadn't really thought this through myself, until, well, let me step back, take a step back. So, I think when I was first working on Du Bois's conception of beauty, I was thinking of Du Bois as trying to arrive at, a kind of, exhaustive account of the nature of beauty, as if he was trying to identify, the individually necessary and jointly sufficient, conditions for something to count as beautiful. I then decided, no, that's not what Du Bois is doing. And I began, and part of the provocation came when I was getting these questions from kind of philosophers who wanted necessary and sufficient conditions. And Gayatri Spivak said to me, well, look, you need to think about why Du Bois is interested in beauty. And I think that's exactly right. Why was Du Bois interested in beauty? And so I argue in the book that Du Bois is not interested in giving an exhaustive account of beauty. He's interested in beauty, in those features of beauty, and this is both the completeness and the anticipation of the disclosure of unrealized possibility or unrealized possibility. He's interested in those features of beauty because I think he sees those features of beauty as functioning to. He asks himself, what is it about beauty that functions to limit, constrain, limit and constrain ugliness? So Du Bois, I argue, is a realist. He's not, he's a realist about beauty. Beauty exists in the world and it functions to limit and constrain ugliness. And when he wants to ask, and already there, if you're thinking in those terms, you immediately see that he's moving beyond a conception of beauty in terms of something like a judgment of taste, right? Beauty is something in the world, right? it has a kind of functionality vis-a-vis delimiting and constraining, the sway of ugliness. And ugliness will never be completely overcome, but it can't. But it, as I said in the quotation I read early on, its volume and force can be we can reduce its volume, and we can reduce its intensity, its force. So that's why Du Bois is interested in beauty. But even then, we've got ugliness on one side, beauty on the other, beauty involving elements of conventional conceptions. Du Bois' the conception of beauty involving elements of conventional early modern European conception of beauty, but also involving some elements of early modern conceptions of the sublime. So we have to go slowly and think carefully about the specificity of what Du Bois is saying, because his thinking, while responsive to these traditions, is actually monkeying with them, doing interesting, complicated things with them that such that we can't neatly, I think, fit his aesthetics, into a received ways of thinking about things. I mean, he's doing something new that is obviously, on the other hand, informed by the traditions, the intellectual traditions he receives.
I think we have reached the end of our time, and it is almost noon, or it is past noon. So let me take this opportunity to thank all of our audience who are there and who have now disappeared to some extent. And I would like to thank Bob for agreeing to appear on our Questioning the Present session. And this has been very productive. And I would like to thank our respondents, Lawrie Balfour, whom I can see, and Fred Moten, who's already left, and Shatema Threadcraft, probably here. So all of you, thank you for participating in this extraordinary session on Du Bois' Beauty and Democracy, the Political Aesthetic of E.W. Du Bois. Thanks, Robert, and congratulations on this incredible book. And I hope we'll hear more about this book and responses to your book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you for, I've seen the names of various, friends. Thank you all for coming, and thank you also the people that I don't know. Thank everyone for coming. Friends and people whom I'm just now meeting. Okay, and especially thanks to Dilip, Lawrie, Fred, and Shatema for a set of remarks that I still have to kind of that I will continue to grapple with, long after this discussion.
Thank you, everybody.